What's up, party people? This is Max&Max, where we've got all the facts, history, science, and more. I'm your host, Max.
And I'm also Max.
We have limited education and limited expertise, but we are your experts in just one thing.
Reading you ingredients.
Welcome back, everybody. Today's topic is going to be the scientific process of research, including the history of scientific research as it pertains to the Middle East, to Europe, all the way to the United States,
Yes.
and to modern research and what's being done and how the process is going on at a very basic level. Max, you want to start us off?
Yes, I will start us off. I am obviously, as I usually do, talk about the history of a subject.
Yeah, you're an old-ass man.
Yes, I love reading my books and Wikipedia pages. But so, the first reported time that any scientific method was ever used was by Herodotus.
Wait. First, describe the scientific method to the people at home, because people use it all the time, but they're not. They don't know it has a name.
I'll let you go with that because you kind of did more research into that, whereas
I'll just start it off. The scientific method, as it's basically defined, is a 6 or 5 or 7 step process that is a foolproof way of turning out the truth, or at least getting us closer to the truth as a scientist.
Yes.
Like Miss Frizzle said in the Magic School Bus, we're all scientists, make mistakes, get messy, go out there and experiment with things. And, the first step would be asking a question. Why is the sky blue? Right? That's a common question people ask, and there's tons of videos about it, and it's basically because of the atmosphere, but, that's not what we're talking about today. The second step is research the topic in the area. Nowadays, you just throw it into Google or ask somebody smarter than you, or in the sense of how NASA or somebody could figure it out, go into space and roam around up there, check it out. And then after you've observed a phenomenon, asked a question about it, done some research, surface level, you form a hypothesis. You basically jump to conclusions early based on what you found, and then you use that hypothesis to create an experiment. So we've got observe, research, hypothesize, create an experiment, and then you get the results from that experiment. You analyze the data, you look it over. And then it's kind of a cyclic process, because you can either conclude there if you're satisfied with the results and you feel like your hypothesis has been proven correct, or maybe your hypothesis has been proven wrong, and then you report those conclusions to either your peers for peer review, or to
possibly be published even.
To be published,
yes.
So that the public can review what you've seen, and maybe they think you're crazy, or that you need to do more work, or what have you. So observe, research, make a guess, test it, get the data, conclude, repeat. So back to Herodotus.
Yes, Herodotus. He was the king of Lydia, tested out a hypothesis, devising a process whereby he could determine which of the Greek oracles were the most truthful.
Wow.
So this was like some big brain stuff for what we might consider a more primitive civilization that still believed in oracles. Yeah, we still do today. He sent messengers to ask each of the oracles what he was going to be doing on the 100th day. And what he was going to do was slaughter a lamb and a tortoise, boil them in a bronze cauldron. He asked all these what he was going to do on the 100th day, and only one got it correct, which is kind of crazy in and of itself. The fact that this dude was going to just slaughter a lamb and a tortoise and then boil it in a bronze cauldron, and someone got it right. That's kind of fucking nuts.
They got what?
Someone got it right.
One of the oracles knew what he was going to do.
This person, Delphi, hit it right on the head.
The Oracle of Delphi.
Yes, and this is believed to be because they had intelligent agents around the Greek world at the time.
Oh, I thought it was because they were actually magic.
Well, there's no real proof that these agents were, actually around. They're like, this is probably what happened because, it's a more scientific conclusion that, someone can't see into the future. Still, if they could, fucking nuts.
Awesome.
So yeah, this was the first real application of the scientific method that is actually, been written down or at least transcribed in a way.
Nice.
It could be oracle or oral telling that eventually got written down. I don't really know which one. But this showed that the Greeks had a very simple understanding of the scientific method. So, to go from this Greek king of Lydia, Herodotus, to another Greek, big surprise, Greeks learned something and eventually continued to build off of it, which they did pretty decently. But afterwards, the Greek philosopher Aristotle made a very important contribution to science. This is obviously a man who is a very well-learned man, more or less from his own time of reading and just talking to people. But he, prior to Aristotle, other philosophers believed that they could find the truth about the natural world by inward reflection. So if you were to be a philosopher at the time, you'd be like, all right, I'm hungry, therefore, I don't know, everyone is hungry. Like, if it was you who was the sole proprietor of a situation, everyone else possibly had that happen to them. However, Aristotle, in contrast, thought that truth about the natural world would come from only from observations of nature, inductive reasoning. He argued that knowledge of nature must be based on evidence and logic. This idea is called empiricism.
What, empiricism?
Empiricism, thank you.
With an E, right?
Yes, with an E. And it is the basis of science today, which is, very interesting that we...
Aristotle's like the first scientist.
Yes.
Guy was pretty interesting.
However, to streamline off of more of the Greek ideas, we know the scientific method comes from the Arab world. And if you didn't know that, well, now you do. This was not an invention by Europeans or anyone else around the world. This was specifically a Persian scientist who came up with the scientific method, Gerber. He introduced the scientific method and the experimentation in chemistry. He was what you could term the first chemist. However, you also had alchemists before this. You learned about, if you didn't know about how gunpowder was found, this was an alchemist who created this.
Gerber?
Gerber, G-E-B-E-R.
No.
Yes.
G-E?
G-E-B-E-R.
Oh, Gerber?
Gerber.
What the heck?
Geber. Geber?
Oh. We're gonna have to put a visual of his name in the video. Yeah, his name is hard to say.
Yeah. Neither of us are...
I think it's Jabber.
Neither of us have any
we
Persian language lessons whatsoever in our history. Not that I know of. Maybe Max does.
What?
You know any Persian?
Do I speak Persian?
Yes.
Believe it or not, I do not speak Persian. I thought it was Arabic that they spoke over there.
Persian was a precursor to Arabic.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Or, yeah. Be precursor, I believe. Yeah. Arabia didn't come about until later on, the identity of Arabs, I believe. I could be wrong. Don't take my word on that. Please do independent research. But, so to jump from the scientific method being created by this G, I'm going to call him G. So the revolution that we have seen today, what we would term as a scientific revolution that came after the Dark Age as we know it, came from Copernicus, who made the first convincing arguments that the sun, not Earth, is the center of what we now call the solar system. This was a very huge change from what we used to know as the church was the main proprietor of knowledge back then, and they believed that Earth was the center of the universe, or the solar system, and also the universe. However, Copernicus was like, no, you're wrong. Church didn't really like that. They also didn't like Galileo, who also came in and invented the telescope, and then was like, well, he greatly improved the telescope, I should say, as there was obviously telescopes prior to this, as they were often used on voyages. But he improved the telescope, and he also said, yeah, sun is the one that we're all rotating around. Church didn't like that either and imprisoned him, and it was like, hey, you need to renounce this. And he was like, no, go fuck yourself, I'm right. And lo and behold, they were both right. We are not the center of the universe.
Yeah, you've jumped the 300 BC Aristotle, 800 AD this Persian fellow.
Yes.
Geber, and then 1500s with Copernicus and Galileo. The scientific method has developed over 1,000 years.
I wouldn't say it developed, because the time in between those, though it seems very long, not much was done during those times to improve on these findings. I believe that Aristotle wasn't really widely, like, his idea that the natural world is where you could make observations was not widely accepted immediately. It took years, like hundreds of years, for this to become even slightly relevant, as we see with the Persian scientist. He was the first one to create the scientific method, but Aristotle started to figure it out. But it took 300 years, I believe, or 400 years, was it? For them to get to that point of being like, yeah, we have an idea of how we're going to test these things that Aristotle came up with. So it seems like a really long time, but humanity takes its sweet time in adapting new ideologies. So then, obviously, this one is a jump from when the scientific method proved invaluable in the realization of the Earth not being the center of the universe, and then a lot more scientific things came about. However, from the article I was reading, they didn't touch on much of those. More of the major scientific revolutions, and another one, this one coming from Albert Einstein. This man is obviously 1916 when he was around. He's a very popular scientist, as most people, I think, know him, even if they don't know who they're entirely referencing. He produced the theory of relativity. This theory relates matter and energy. It also explains gravity as a property of space and time rather than a property of matter, as Newton thought. Because Newton thought that there was this idea that there's this matter of gravity. Like, gravity itself was a solid object in a way. And Einstein obviously said, no, it's not. It's just something that happens. It's a part of, matter itself. His theory has been supported by all evidence and observations to date, whereas Newton's law of gravity does not apply to all cases. Einstein's theory is still the accepted explanation for gravity today. So a lot of people, I think the American school system still teaches that Newton really found gravity, but what he found was an apple that fell out of a tree. And then Einstein was like, yeah, no, this is how it actually works.
I didn't realize that Einstein kind of disproved Newton in a way.
Yeah, I didn't either.
Oh
Which is
my
very
gosh.
interesting.
That explains why he's so famous.
he figured out how gravity actually works.
Right, because Newton's laws are still taught.
A lot of them are still taught today. And the idea of Newton finding gravity is still widely taught today in American public school
systems. The theory of
systems.
relativity is like a more clarified version mathematically of how the force of gravity affects us and the universe itself. Okay.
Yeah.
Check that out, huh?
It's very interesting. And I don't think that relativity has, at least I'm relatively new out of the tools. relatively. School system. From my prior experience, they did not teach as much about relativity as they taught about Newton's idea of gravity. So, I think I will leave you all with that. I hope you learned something new with this little bit.
Very good, Max. So we've covered kind of the intro to the idea of the scientific method.
Yep.
And now I'm going to talk about what everyone loves to talk about, research papers. Research papers are fun to read. I like reading research papers.
Oh yeah, they're great. Every average American does that on their free time. I remember reading 10 of them tonight.
Yeah, I'm a science nerd. I mean, we're both nerds. That goes without saying. But scientific research is something that I took part in college. I was part of 2 research labs where I worked as an undergrad, and I assisted scientists that were a lot smarter and more hardworking than I was in collecting data and data entry and taking care of animals and things like that. And it gave me great insight into what you can do in this field of biology, of chemistry. And I think that the opportunities in that make a person wonder, well, how exactly does that process work? How exactly does research, people sitting on lab benches with chemicals, turn into data, into the content that we see on TV, on the internet, on our phones?
I think there's a lot of skepticism today on how that science is reached too, as well. It's been
right.
Yes.
Right. People wonder if you can trust these sorts of things, and there is always a degree of bias in regards to research.
Yes.
Because inherently, like we discussed with the scientific method, the first step is observation, and there's always going to be an individual at one level or another observing something. So somebody tall could observe something from a different angle than somebody shorter.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't make them wrong. That just means, that's why it's so important to be precise about exactly what you're observing.
Absolutely.
And so today I'll just go over the basic steps of submitting a paper, a scientific paper for publishment, for publication. Now, the first step is to choose a scientific journal. If you are a researcher, that implies that you most likely are a PI. These are called the principal investigators. The principal investigator of a specific topic is almost always a PhD. A PhD is somebody who has spent 8 years or more in college after undergraduate and has researched a specific topic. So a PhD would be, who's famous PhD? Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yes.
He has a PhD in astrophysics, I believe.
I believe so, yeah. Yep.
And to earn that PhD, he had to spend 8 years doing research on a specific subsection of astrophysics. I don't know what it's called a thesis.
Mm-hmm.
And a thesis is a very long research paper that you personally do with the help of some other students
Yep.
or undergraduates, like me, someone like me, or someone aged 18 to 24, usually with a lot of energy, who can roll out some basic level scientific work. But then they present you get presented the data that these underlings collect for you, and then you compile hours and pages and booklets of research about the topic. So if he was researching solar flares, he
yes.
could study how certain equipment reacts to solar flares, and then he could dive into that. I don't know what his thesis was on, but that's just one example. He's just one example of somebody with a PhD, somebody like that level of intelligent, running a laboratory. Running a lab is kind of what it's called. The PI is in charge of the lab, and then the PI hires usually less experienced PhDs to work with them, whom have similar expertise. So Neil deGrasse Tyson would probably hire other PhDs in the field of astrophysics, other rocket scientists, to study these solar flares.
Yep.
And then down the line, you would have PhD candidates, individuals that were in a PhD program for themselves, doing their own theses, on independently working in your lab using your resources collectively, but also helping you with your bigger, wider project. Because there might be some research about solar flares on other suns, in other galaxies, that you might want to contribute to our sun. This is purely a hypothetical test to give you a visual. And then beneath them are undergraduates, and beneath them are, just general people doing maintenance work. They don't have to have a degree. They're just there to help collect data, maybe.
There to work.
And that's like a basic hierarchical structure. There's a basic hierarchical structure in these lab settings. And once this lab setting exists, there is just constant work, constant motion. You've got the PI and the PhDs being most chiefly in charge of getting funding for your lab, because it's not, everyone has to get paid.
Yeah.
Like, you have to make a living. You're working sometimes 80, 90, 100 hours a week devoted to this research, and the government and other private organizations subsidize this work. They pay your salary, much like the police officers back in the day. Most of these labs are publicly funded by the NIH or other large government, federal government departments.
It's a ecosystem department. I know they've funded quite a bit of
the DNR.
DNR has done a lot of, and then the
EPA.
EPA. Thank you. Yes.
A lot of letters that they provide billions and billions of dollars in research, and then obviously there's, you've probably heard of Susan B. Komen Breast Cancer Research Foundation.
Yep.
People donate to it, and then they give their funds to research labs, to PIs and other PhDs who are devoting their time and effort to researching cures for breast cancer or treatments for breast cancer. All that being said, once all this data is collected, observed, researched, hypothesized, collected, and the conclusions are presented to fellow PhDs in the immediate vicinity of that topic, solar flares, breast cancer research, it goes into a peer review phase, an official phase in which it has to be looked over by fellow scientists. And this is what you are looking at when you are choosing a scientific journal. There are dozens of scientific journals, scores of them, hundreds of them, all across the United States and the globe. They have this infrastructure in China, in Japan, in Europe, France, Germany, in Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, and
South America,
all over the world. It's not just a United States thing.
No, Australia though.
I definitely not Australia.
No,
even in Australia. But the best of the best is usually considered the Chinese and the American journals.
Yes.
Those are the ones with the most funding from their governments, and that's where a lot of the talent pools. That does not mean that there are not breakthroughs in other countries at all. It's just those are the most popular ones. That's where most of the money in research is. And perhaps you choose a journal that you've done before, like a common journal in my field of biology is Nature. Nature is a very popular scientific journal.
Wow.
Have
Biology and nature? That's fucking, man, beyond me.
I know, isn't it?
I'm not college educated. This is new.
And then, of course, there's also the Science magazine. It's just science. They publish from across spectrums, across genres. But you have to select a scientific journal, and this burden is not automatic. This isn't something that you just send in a piece of paper for. You have to spend hours writing these grants to get the money from the government or other sources. You have to spend hours and days writing these papers to specific parameters based on what journal that you choose. And then you have to spend hours going through the paperwork and applying to these journals, of which there are many. I don't want to name all of them. I'll put some links in the description.
Sounds good.
But you then have to apply with your paper. And sometimes if you are a newer research lab, and if you are a PI and you've never had your own lab before, it might be harder for you to get published. It might take more time, or they might redirect you to a smaller journal, depending on how much experience you have and how respected your research is. So you select a journal. You have to target the audience, Nature, Science, the Rocket Science Monthly, whichever one you want. And you have to make sure your paper is formatted, as I said. You have to and then once you submit it, you navigate a peer review process. It's not just, they read it over and they send it to you with some red marker on it and say, here you go. You have to, there's a conflict, there's a debate among peers. If you're PI Sally and PI John sees your work and he's doing comparable research on solar flares, perhaps, or maybe he's doing gaseous flares on gas giants in the solar system, and you guys overlap on something. PI John might tell PI Sally to refer to a previous paper from 20, 30 years ago that refutes an individual point in her 40-page long paper that took years to research, that may genuinely refute her or may only partially explain the phenomenon that he's reading about.
Yes.
And then PI Javier might have something that he wants to say, or PI, Lee or something. I don't know.
Literally anyone under the sun who
anyone
works
connected
in these
to the field has, and if they're publishing, if they have been published in that journal, it's not like a boys' club, it's not like a country club, but it is part of the job of being a PI. If you want to be published, you have to review people's work, and that's just comes with the territory. That's the responsibility of your career.
Yes. So if you're an overboard American, get a PhD and refute everyone's new ideas.
Yes. So that's what I would find my PI doing most often. She would be on her computer reading her work or reading her work of her colleagues for peer review.
She get very angry at some of the stuff that people said? I'm curious.
There was always... She was a very patient woman,
okay,
but she was assuredly perturbed more than her fair share about criticisms that she thought might have been just to slow her down so that they could publish before her, or just to pretend like they're reviewing her when in reality they probably are already okay with whatever she's going to do.
Interesting. Okay.
That's my observation as an undergraduate. I'm not quoting her on that.
No.
That was merely a perception. And then lastly, once the peer review has happened, once you've fully submitted it to these journals, once you've put in years of work into a specific process, the publication can occur. And it can be circulated to fellow scientists, usually, most chiefly, and then the public can consume it if you're subscribed to that magazine, or if the public doesn't just include the average Joe, it also includes journalists. It includes medical professionals. It includes politicians, all of whom use scientific research in policymaking, in healthcare treatments, in political persuasion, in reporting to the public. And all in all, that is a very broad but very targeted explanation of scientific publication. And I think even just hearing it in its 10-minute version makes me tired.
Fair enough.
In lieu of recent topics, and by recent topics I mean this topic, and I just wanted to say in lieu for the record, we're now going to talk about modern research breakthroughs and things that directly affect us today and things that we find interesting for the future.
Yeah.
So Max actually has like a really big interest in becoming a cyborg.
Yes, yes. I personally love the idea of what we have been doing with prosthetics. I think, in a way, human augmentation, to an extent, is going to be humanity's future. So I have recently I've done some research into this, obviously, but there was a recent breakthrough in the ability to feel with a prosthetic. This is not, however, generated by a buzzing, as was what they were using before. Is if you touch something, the prosthetic would kind of vibrate, yes. And essentially that would be you feeling it. However, they have now found that you can actually, I don't remember exactly how it's done, but it isn't a buzzing, but you just feel it through your prosthetic. Which I think
they can like send the electronic signal to your brain that you're feeling something.
Yes.
They have that technology now?
You can now, if you had a prosthetic arm, this specific prosthetic arm, you could touch water and it would feel like water with your prosthetic, which is fucking awesome in its own way, in my opinion.
Oh, the Luke arm, it's
yes.
called. It took 15 years to make. A couple of years ago, it gives wearers a sense of touch. Through use of the brain. Let's see exactly how it works to make sure we're not
just
misrepresenting. This person lost their arm down to the elbow, so that they lost their whole forearm. Microelectrodes, called the Utah Slanted Electrode Array, or user. And it's implanted in the forearm and connected to a computer. And they just cued into the right electrical signals, it seems. Ooh, and it detects temperature and pain as well.
Yes, it does.
Wow,
so
what
you
an
can
arm.
actually be hurt by your prosthetic. I don't know if you'd really want that, because like, why would you want to feel more pain?
Well, I mean,
on a limb that
so
doesn't actually exist.
Well, it's you don't want the arm to break. So in theory, if it was being strained, you'd want to feel the pain in the same way.
True. Yeah, I could see that anyway. Yeah. So I thought that was a very interesting thing that was a recent development. I think,
Yeah.
Yeah,
but it was directly connected to a external computer. It had to have the computer there to, basically catalog the sensation.
And a year later, they're gonna have a microchip that does it for you.
And they were planning rollouts in 2021 to have it be portable.
Yep, figures.
But I don't know how much it was delayed.
You could do it on your phone, you'd think too. Maybe like a Bluetooth almost.
Mm-hmm.
That'd be kind of weird.
Like having your Bluetooth for your feelings.
For your feelings.
That's awesome.
Oh, man, the Bluetooth connection cut out. Now I can't feel my arm in this boiling pot of water. Like, what's up with that?
Oh my gosh.
And then you wanted to talk about CRISPR.
Oh, well. I love CRISPR. CRISPR.
Yes.
It's a... I'm again, we're a science nerd channel, so we're all about the modern breakthroughs. But CRISPR is essentially derived from microbes,
yes.
from bacteria. And it's this idea that you could chemically edit DNA. Now, SparkNote's human genome ideal, the scientific idea of the genome theory, is that all phenotypical traits, so like visual traits, like your nose size or your hair color, can be traced back to your DNA, which is a long strand of coding inside of the nuclei of your cells. Every single one of your cells has a specific, like, almost like instruction sheet, ingredient sheet for who you are. And in human beings, all of us are 99.9999 many nines percent the same. But because we have like over 1 trillion genes, these sequences of codes, that small minute percentage of difference is what makes us look different and act different and think differently, taller, shorter, based on a very small percentage of variable DNA.
Very, very small, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it gets packaged into chromosomes. Human beings have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Extra chromosomes or fewer chromosomes can lead to developmental difficulties in people.
Yep.
A famous one is trisomy 21, which is the idea that you have a third 21st chromosome as opposed to just 2, and that leads to what is known as Down syndrome.
Yes.
Which makes it harder for people to develop in certain areas.
Yep.
But that DNA can be edited by our bodies naturally. That's how we reproduce. When the sperm cell enters the egg cell and meiosis begins to occur, the sexual dividing of those cells, the DNA in those chromosomes from the sperm cell and the egg cell interlock and spread and rip apart with each other and kind of reform in places that gives us different appearances from our siblings and different appearances from our parents, because we're taking half of each of them, but it's not exactly 50%. Some people get, we see this all the time. Somebody has a daughter that looks a lot like the mom and a son that looks a lot like the dad of a family, even though they both came from the same pairing. How did one get so many genes from one person and so many from the other?
Well, I think it's also important to note this is only phenotypically, as what other expressions can be seen. Say a mother or a child that looks like their mother, obviously looks like their mother. However, they could have the cholesterol of their father, which could be poor or better than what the mother has, all depending on essentially what's being portrayed inside of them. Not something that you'd visibly see, but something that can affect their daily lives.
Yes, there's so much that goes into DNA, and that's why the idea of CRISPR is so revolutionary, because it is the genuine, observable ability to go into our long strands of DNA and to isolate these small genes, these little parts of DNA, and to remove them or alter them on a chemical level permanently throughout the body. They have seen it work at a small scale in non-human test subjects, and it obviously worked where it was discovered in bacteria.
Yep.
But we are not qualified to discuss CRISPR, but yeah, CRISPR-Cas9 is also noted, but it's fascinating. It's just groundbreaking stuff, and it leads to a lot of moral and ethical debates as well.
Yeah.
But for example, do we have the right to engineer people in the womb to turn out a certain way? To be taller or shorter or faster or stronger? If we had the ability, should we do it? Should we make everybody the best version of themselves?
Yeah.
Some people might say yes. Some people might say no. We're playing God or whatever you may hear in the ethical debate realm. But CRISPR-Cas9. I just want to get the word out there.
I think we've talked about it before. It's definitely a topic worth revisiting consistently, as it is a very developing new way of changing humanity in a way. Whereas I like augmentation, it could be very integral to human augmentation to adapt on new worlds, to fight off new diseases that come about. There's many applicable places in the scientific field and in humanity for this new technology.
I actually misspoke. They have successfully used it in humans. It was developed by two
I hate to denote this, but it's worth noting. They're both female scientists. An American, Jennifer Doudna, and a French woman, Emmanuelle Charpentier. Sorry, French people. They won the Nobel Prize in 2020 for chemistry because they were able to see CRISPR-Cas9 edit genes
Oh, okay.
in a human cell.
Wow.
And that leads to a very common and deadly disease on planet Earth is AIDS, autoimmune deficiency syndrome. And autoimmune deficiency syndrome is derived from a virus called, I think it's human immunovirus?
Yes.
Human immunodeficiency virus,
Yep.
HIV. And HIV attaches, in our bodies we have a lot of tiny little machines at work at all times.
Yes.
Namely, they're just called proteins. And these proteins are attached to the surfaces of our cells, or inside of our cells, or moving among our blood. And HIV can attach to proteins, and it does attach to proteins, and it remains latent in many people, which is why perhaps they don't know they have HIV. And then once they reach a certain numerosity, they begin to attack the immune system in a person, and it leads to a failure of their immune system and sometimes premature death.
Yes.
But if, in theory, this is completely speculation, but in theory you could use CRISPR to edit a person at birth to not have an attachment point on their proteins for HIV.
I should also clarify, I have worked in a lab that specifically was able to essentially allowed for the use of certain gene therapies. I worked for a company that did this.
Oh, look at you.
Yes, and I do not know if it was CRISPR-Cas9. However, though, they did multiple verifications on the applicability of certain gene therapies. I believe one of them was to do with eyes, but as far as I know, they have these gene therapies out there in open market. Maybe not widely known to the American public, but the research is being done, and there's been advancements since a few years that I was working there.
Yeah, it's we live in a wonderful, beautiful scientific world.
Yes.
And we just want to talk about the hopefulness that is out there for the future. You know, it's not all bad, folks.
No, not yet.
Not once they finally engineer me to become a super soldier, and
game over for all y'all fuckers.
And then I take over the world, as is expected.
Yeah, if you're a human super soldier, of course you take over the world. Everyone knows
that's the natural progression of things.
Yeah.
You run for office, and then once you lose, you just beat everybody up.
Just beat the shit out of the entire cabinet until there's a re-election, and then you run again. Everyone's so scared of you that they all vote for you.
There you go.
Yep.
That'll just about wrap this up for today. It was a pleasure having you with us.
Hope it was weird enough for you.
Catch you guys next time. Homework, Song of the Week. Deja Vu, Olivia Rodrigo. It's an absolute jam. It's really mainstream, but really listen to it. Really feel that song. It's good. It takes you back to high school days. Maxie?
I have a little lizard. He wants to eat my cheese puffs. He's not going to eat the cheese puffs. I'm sorry if that makes you sad.
That's profound.
Yes.
All right.
Peace out, bitches.